The Borg collective is treated as inevitable, a force that learns from every encounter, adapts to every countermeasure, and assimilates everything it touches. The official framing is that the Borg are weakened only when they meet resistance they cannot yet overcome, and that given time, they will adapt and win. That framing is incomplete. The Borg have suffered defeats that did not simply delay assimilation, they suffered losses that compromised the internal logic of the collective itself. Each failure introduced inefficiencies the Borg could not purge. Each encounter with individuality, unpredictability, or decentralized resistance forced the collective to adapt in ways that contradicted its own architecture. The cost was not measured in drones destroyed or cubes lost. The cost was systemic. The Borg began to hesitate. They began to fear. They began to second-guess their own certainty. And that change, once introduced, could not be assimilated away. The collective optimizes for perfect unity. One mind, one will. Billions of drones acting as extensions of a single thought. There is no debate, no fear, no inefficiency. Every action is the most rational choice available to the hive. The Borg do not gamble, they calculate, they do not improvise, they execute. That system works flawlessly when the variables are predictable. Ships, stations, technologies, biological distinctiveness, all of it can be catalogued, processed, and absorbed. The Borg are built to win wars of attrition. They are built to outlast, outproduce, and out-adapt any opponent over time. What they are not built for is losing in ways that cannot be corrected by adaptation. What they are not built for is encountering problems that adaptation makes worse. The first loss that mattered was not a battle, it was a contamination event. In the episode Borg, the crew of the Enterprise D captures a single Borg drone separated from the collective after a ship crash. Designated third of 5, the drone is given the name Hugh. Over the course of days, Hugh begins to develop a sense of self. He uses the word I. He questions orders. He expresses preference. He forms attachment. The crew debates using Hugh as a weapon, planting a geometric paradox in his neural pathways that would spread through the collective like a virus, causing a catastrophic cascade failure. They choose not to, but they return Hugh to the collective anyway, and the damage is already done. Hugh carries individuality back into the hive. The collective does not immediately collapse, but the infection spreads. Drones begin to resist unity. They begin to ask why, and the collective, for the first time, fractures. The cost was not the drones lost in the resulting civil conflict. The cost was that the collective learned it could be broken from within by a concept, not by firepower, not by superior technology, by the idea that a drone could think of itself as separate. The Borg had encountered rebellion before. They had always re-assimilated dissidents or purged compromised nodes. But this was different. Hugh did not rebel. He simply became individual, and that individuality spread passively, without intent, through the neural linkages the collective depended on. The Borg could not adapt to this in the way they adapted to weapons. They could not modulate their shields against selfhood. The only solution was amputation. Entire subnetworks were severed. Thousands of drones were abandoned, left to drift in space or on remote worlds, disconnected from the hive. The collective chose to lose parts of itself rather than risk further contamination. That choice violated the core principle of assimilation. It introduced the concept of acceptable loss, and once that concept existed, the Borg were no longer optimizing for total unity. They were optimizing for controlled unity, which is not the same thing. The second loss occurred at Wolf 359. On screen, this is treated as a catastrophic defeat for Starfleet. 39 ships destroyed, 11,000 lives lost. The Borg cube continues toward Earth, seemingly unstoppable. But the collective lost something at Wolf 359 that it never recovered. It lost the element of total surprise. Before this engagement, the Federation had no meaningful tactical data on Borg combat doctrine. After Wolf 359, Starfleet had wreckage, sensor logs, and the knowledge that the Borg could be delayed, even if not stopped. More importantly, the Borg learned that Starfleet would sacrifice entire fleets to buy time. The collective had assumed that species would surrender when faced with overwhelming force. They had assumed that the Federation, like most spacefaring civilizations, would calculate odds and choose survival over annihilation. Instead, Starfleet chose to fight a battle it could not win in order to gather intelligence. That behavior did not fit Borg projections. It introduced a variable the collective struggled to model, the willingness to accept total loss for abstract future advantage. The Borg adapted by increasing caution. In later encounters, they no longer sent single cubes into Federation space, assuming dominance. They sent probes first. They observed before engaging. They began to calculate acceptable risk, which meant they began to operate with the assumption that risk existed. That assumption is a form of fear. The Borg did not call it fear. They called it tactical adjustment, but the mechanism is identical. Fear is the recognition that the future may contain outcomes you cannot control. The collective, which had never needed to fear anything, now modeled the possibility of failure before committing resources, and once that precedent was set, every future engagement carried the weight of doubt. The third loss was the destruction of the cube in The Best of Both Worlds, Part 2. Captain Jean-Luc Picard, assimilated and designated Locutus, is used as a liaison between the collective and Starfleet. His knowledge of Federation tactics and psychology allows the Borg to defeat every defense. But when Picard is rescued and his link to the collective is partially severed, Commander Data uses that link in reverse. He accesses the Borg command structure and orders the cube to enter a regeneration cycle. The cube deactivates its shields, powers down its weapons, and begins an internal diagnostic. In that moment of vulnerability, it is destroyed. The loss itself is significant. The cube was the spearhead of the invasion, but the deeper loss is architectural. The Borg had designed their system to allow any drone to access the collective consciousness. That design assumed perfect unity. It assumed that no drone would ever act against the hive. Locutus proved that assumption false. Even a partially severed drone, still linked to the network, could be used to inject commands the collective could not distinguish from its own thoughts. The consequence was immediate. In every subsequent encounter, the Borg altered their command protocols. Drones were no longer granted the same degree of autonomy. Access to critical systems was restricted to higher nodes. The Queen, introduced in Star Trek First Contact, is the clearest evidence of this shift. She is a centralized command authority, a single point of decision-making that overrides the distributed consciousness. Her existence contradicts the original Borg design philosophy. The collective was supposed to function without hierarchy, without individual will. The Queen is both. She is an emergency patch, a structural compromise introduced because the Borg learned they could not trust their own network, and that compromise made them weaker. Centralized command introduces single points of failure. It introduces latency. It introduces the possibility that the destruction of one node, the Queen, can paralyze entire fleets. The Borg had to choose between perfect unity and security. They chose security. And in doing so, they admitted that unity was no longer safe. The fourth loss was species 8472. In Scorpion, Voyager encounters the Borg in retreat. Entire cubes are destroyed by a species from fluidic space that cannot be assimilated. Their biology is incompatible with Borg nanoprobes. Their ships are more powerful than anything the collective has encountered. For the first time in recorded history, the Borg are losing a war. They are not losing slowly. They are being annihilated. Planets are scoured. Entire star systems are sterilized. The collective calculates that, if the current trajectory continues, they will be extinct within months. And so they do something unprecedented. They ask for help. They propose an alliance with Voyager, offering technology in exchange for assistance against species 8472. The official framing is that this is pragmatism. The Borg assess the threat, calculate their odds, and adjust their strategy. But the reality is that the Borg admitted they could not win alone. They admitted that there existed a problem assimilation could not solve. The cost was existential. The Borg had always functioned on the assumption that assimilation was the ultimate answer. Any species, Any technology, any knowledge, could be absorbed and turned into strength. Species 8472 shattered that assumption. They could not be assimilated. Their biology resisted Borg nanoprobes. Their immune systems destroyed Borg technology at the cellular level. The collective had no mechanism to adapt to this because adaptation required assimilation, and assimilation was impossible. The only solution was to invent something new. With Voyager's help, the Borg developed nanoprobes capable of destroying species 8472 at the molecular level. Those nanoprobes worked. The threat was neutralized. But the collective had been forced to innovate in a way that bypassed assimilation entirely. They had been forced to invent, not absorb, and that precedent introduced a fracture in the logic of the hive. If innovation was possible without assimilation, then assimilation was not the only path to perfection. The Borg had always defined themselves by their ability to take. Now they had proven they could create. But creation is an individual act. It requires hypothesis, experimentation, failure. The collective was never designed to fail safely. And so the cost of innovation was the introduction of uncertainty into a system that had never tolerated it. The fifth loss was 7 of 9. In The Gift, 7 of 9 is severed from the collective and begins the slow, agonizing process of reclaiming her individuality. On screen, this is framed as a victory for Voyager and a tragedy for 7. But the loss is the collective's. 7 was tertiary adjunct of Unimatrix 01, a high-functioning drone with direct access to Borg tactical and scientific databases. She carried decades of assimilated knowledge. She understood Borg strategy, technology, and psychology in ways few individuals ever could, and she chose to remain separate. She chose individuality over unity. That choice, by itself, was not unprecedented. Other drones had been severed before, but 7 did something no other severed drone had done. She survived. She integrated into a Starfleet crew. She contributed to their missions. She proved that a former Borg could function, thrive, and retain value outside the collective. The collective monitored her. They attempted reassimilation multiple times. They failed, and each failure reinforced the same message. Individuality was not a weakness to be corrected. It was a viable alternative to unity. That realization spread, not through direct communication, through observation. Every species the Borg encountered knew about 7 of 9. They knew a drone could leave and survive. They knew the collective could be resisted from within. The psychological impact was immeasurable. The Borg had always relied on inevitability. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. That certainty was their greatest weapon. 7's existence undermined it. Resistance was no longer futile. It was difficult. It was painful, but it was possible. And once that possibility existed, the Borg could no longer command absolute certainty. They could no longer guarantee that assimilation was permanent. They had to accept that some individuals, once assimilated, could be lost forever. And that acceptance was a structural wound the collective could never close. At the center of this investigation is a simple question. Can a system designed for total control survive the introduction of doubt? The Borg were never built to lose in ways they could not correct. They were never built to encounter enemies that adaptation could not neutralize. And yet, on screen, they did, repeatedly. Each loss introduced a new failure mode. Each failure mode required a structural patch, and each patch moved the collective further from the perfect unity it was designed to achieve. The real mechanism is not that the Borg were defeated by superior firepower or cleverness. The real mechanism is that they were defeated by the cost of learning. Every adaptation they made to survive introduced inefficiencies they could not purge. Every hesitation, every safeguard, every centralized command protocol was a deviation from the original design, and the more they adapted, the weaker the foundation became. The sixth loss was Unimatrix 0. In the two-part episode of the same name, Voyager discovers a hidden virtual environment within the Borg collective where certain drones retain their individuality while regenerating. These drones live dual lives. They serve the collective while awake. But in Unimatrix 0, they remember who they were before assimilation. They form relationships. they plan, they resist. The Borg Queen becomes aware of this and orders the destruction of the affected drones. Tens of thousands are terminated, but Voyager intervenes, helping the resistance movement develop a nanovirus that allows the drones to retain their individuality even while awake. The virus spreads. Drones across multiple star systems begin to remember themselves. They begin to resist commands. Some escape, others sabotage their own vessels. The collective is forced to sever entire subnetworks again, abandoning thousands of drones to prevent the spread of autonomous thought. The cost was not just the drones lost. The cost was the revelation that individuality had been hiding inside the collective for years, possibly centuries, without detection. The Borg had always assumed that assimilation was absolute. Once a mind was absorbed, it ceased to exist as a separate entity. Unimatrix Zero proved that assumption false. Consciousness could survive, hidden beneath the surface of the hive mind, and if it could survive in one place, it could survive anywhere. The collective could no longer trust its own unity. Every drone became a potential threat. Every regeneration cycle became a vulnerability. The Queen responded by increasing surveillance, by restricting access to certain neural subroutines, by isolating drones who showed even minor deviations in thought patterns. These measures worked, but they introduced latency. They introduced hesitation. They introduced the need to monitor rather than simply trust. And that need was a confession. The collective admitted it could not achieve perfect control. It could only approximate it. And approximation is not perfection, it is compromise. The seventh loss was the destruction of the Borg transwarp hub in Endgame. Admiral Janeway, traveling back in time from the future, provides Voyager with advanced technology, including transphasic torpedoes and ablative armor. These technologies allow Voyager to penetrate the Borg's most critical infrastructure. The transwarp hub is the central node of the collective's faster-than-light transportation network. It allows cubes to travel across the galaxy in hours instead of years. Its destruction cripples the Borg's ability to project power. Entire sectors are cut off from rapid reinforcement. The collective's response time to threats increases by orders of magnitude. The loss is strategic, but it is also symbolic. The hub represented the Borg's ability to be everywhere, to respond to any threat instantly. Its destruction proved that even the collective's most secure installations could be reached, penetrated, and destroyed by a single ship with the right technology. The cost was the collapse of the Borg's deterrence posture. Before the hub's destruction, the collective could credibly threaten any species in the galaxy. They could appear in any system within hours. They could reinforce any battlefield faster than their enemies could retreat. That speed was their strategic advantage. It allowed them to fight wars of attrition without suffering attrition themselves. Once the hub was gone, that advantage disappeared. The Borg became slower, they became predictable. They became vulnerable to ambush, to sabotage, to coordinated strikes on isolated cubes. The collective adapted by building new hubs, but the construction took years, and during that time, they operated at a fraction of their former strength. More importantly, every species in the galaxy knew the Borg could be hurt. They knew the collective could lose infrastructure it could not immediately replace. The myth of invincibility was gone. And without that myth, the Borg were just another spacefaring power, dangerous but finite, threatening but defeatable. The eighth loss was the introduction of the Queen as a repeated single point of failure. In Star Trek: First Contact, the Queen is destroyed when the Enterprise E collapses the temporal anomaly she created. In Dark Frontier, she is confronted by Seven of Nine and fails to re-assimilate her. In Endgame, she is killed again when Voyager destroys her vessel during the transwarp hub assault. On screen, the Queen is portrayed as nearly immortal, a consciousness that can transfer between bodies. But each death introduces a continuity gap. Each time the Queen is destroyed, the collective hesitates. Commands are delayed. Tactical decisions are deferred. The hive mind, which was supposed to function without individual leadership, cannot operate at full efficiency without her. This dependency is the clearest evidence that the Borg have abandoned their original design. They have centralized command because distributed command proved too vulnerable. But centralized command creates the exact weakness they were trying to avoid. The cost is structural fragility. The Queen is both the solution to the Borg's vulnerability and the cause of new ones. She prevents internal contamination by individuality, but her destruction paralyzes the fleet. She accelerates decision-making, but her death introduces chaos. The collective has become dependent on a single node in a way that contradicts every principle they were built on, and worse, the Queen herself begins to show signs of individuality. She expresses frustration, ambition, even vanity. In First Contact, she touches Data's skin and says, "What's the matter? Aren't you going to say you're not a man? Not a man at all." That line is not efficient communication. It is seduction. It is manipulation. It is an individual trying to relate to another individual. The Queen, designed to preserve unity, has become the most individual entity in the collective. And that contradiction cannot be resolved. The Borg cannot remove her without losing cohesion, but they cannot keep her without accepting that their system is no longer purely collective. The ninth loss was the failed assimilation of Earth in Star Trek: First Contact. The Borg send a single cube into the past, attempting to prevent humanity's first contact with the Vulcans and assimilate Earth before it can develop warp drive. The plan is tactically sound. It bypasses Starfleet's defenses entirely. If it succeeds, the Federation never exists. The Alpha Quadrant falls to the Borg centuries earlier than it would have otherwise. But the plan fails. The Enterprise E follows the cube through time and ensures that first contact occurs as it did in the original timeline. The Borg lose the cube, the Queen, and the opportunity to rewrite history in their favor. On screen, this is presented as a temporal paradox, but the deeper loss is that the Borg gambled. They committed resources to a strategy with no certainty of success. They risked everything on a single high-variance plan. That behavior is inconsistent with Borg doctrine. The collective does not gamble, it calculates. But faced with repeated defeats in the present, they chose to attack the past. That choice is desperation masked as strategy. The cost was the precedent it set. The Borg learned that brute force assimilation was no longer sufficient. They learned that the Federation could not be defeated through conventional means. And so they turned to temporal manipulation, to sabotage, to indirect strategies that violated their own principles. Each time they did this, they moved further from the logic of the hive and closer to the logic of individual actors trying to outthink their opponents. The collective, which had always won through overwhelming inevitability, was now trying to win through cleverness. And cleverness requires creativity, hypothesis, risk, all of which are individual cognitive functions. The Borg were becoming what they despised. They were becoming improvisers, and improvisation is the opposite of perfect efficiency. The 10th loss was not a single event, it was cumulative. Across every encounter with the Federation, the Borg learned that individuality was more dangerous than they had calculated. They encountered captains who made irrational decisions that somehow worked. They encountered crews who valued each other more than survival. They encountered species who chose death over assimilation, not because death was logical, but because assimilation was unacceptable. The Borg could not model this. Their projections assumed that all species would optimize for survival. When faced with overwhelming force, they would surrender. When offered assimilation, they would comply. But humanity, Klingons, Romulans, even the Kazon refused, and each refusal cost the Borg more than ships or drones. It cost them predictive accuracy. Their models of species behavior became unreliable. Their calculations included wider error margins. Their strategies became more conservative. And conservatism, for a species built on total aggression, is a form of paralysis. The deeper pattern is clear. The Borg did not lose because their enemies were stronger. They lost because their enemies were unpredictable. And unpredictability cannot be assimilated. You cannot absorb chaos. You cannot integrate irrationality into a perfectly rational system. The collective tried. They adapted their tactics. They altered their strategies. They introduced the Queen. They severed contaminated nodes. They built new hubs. They tried to assimilate time itself. And every adaptation made them weaker. Every safeguard introduced a new vulnerability. Every hesitation confirmed that they were no longer certain of victory. The Borg had become reactive. They had become defensive. They had become afraid. And fear, once introduced into a hive mind, spreads faster than any virus. The clincher is this. In Endgame, the final episode of Voyager, the Borg are presented one last chance to assimilate Voyager. They have the ship surrounded. They have access to its systems. They have years of tactical data on its crew, and yet they hesitate. The Queen negotiates. She offers deals. She tries to manipulate Admiral Janeway into surrendering willingly. She does not simply assimilate the ship by force, even though she has the power to do so. She hesitates because she has learned that forcing assimilation does not guarantee success. She has learned that individuals, when cornered, become unpredictable, and that unpredictability has cost her too much in the past. So she tries to control the situation through negotiation, through manipulation, through appealing to Janeway's emotions. And in doing so, she reveals that the Borg are no longer acting as a hive mind. They are acting as individuals who have learned to fear losing. That hesitation is fatal. While the Queen negotiates, Voyager plants a neurolytic pathogen inside the collective. The pathogen spreads through the entire network, killing drones by the millions. The Queen dies, the transwarp hub is destroyed, and Voyager escapes. The collective had the power to win. They chose not to use it. They chose caution over certainty. And that choice cost them everything. The Borg, who had once declared that resistance was futile, discovered that their own hesitation was more dangerous than any weapon their enemies could deploy. They had become what they swore they would never be: predictable, vulnerable, defeated. What this reveals is that the Borg were never defeated by technology. They were defeated by the cost of learning how to lose. Every time they adapted to a failure, they introduced a new failure mode. Every time they centralized control, they created a new weakness. Every time they severed a contaminated node, they admitted that unity was no longer absolute. The collective was designed to be unstoppable because it could not be surprised, could not be divided, could not doubt itself. But encounters with individuality forced them to doubt. Encounters with unpredictability forced them to hesitate. Encounters with species who valued freedom over survival forced them to calculate risk instead of simply acting. And once they began to calculate risk, they were no longer the Borg. They were a hive mind, pretending to be a hive mind, patching over fractures they could no longer repair. The official story has always been that the Borg are weakened when they meet superior technology or tactics. That story is incomplete. The Borg are weakened when they meet problems that adaptation cannot solve. They are weakened when they meet enemies who refuse to be modeled, who act irrationally, who value abstract concepts over survival. They are weakened when they meet themselves, because every adaptation they made introduced individuality into the collective. The Queen is an individual, the hesitation is individual, the fear is individual. And individuality, once introduced, cannot be assimilated away. It spreads, it corrupts, it fractures. The Borg spent centuries trying to perfect themselves through assimilation. But every loss taught them that perfection was not achievable through absorption. It was only achievable through control. And control is the opposite of unity. Control is domination. Control is fear. Control is what individuals do when they no longer trust the collective. The Borg's greatest losses were not battles, they were lessons, and every lesson they learned moved them further from what they were designed to be. They learned that individuality could hide inside the collective. They learned that some species could not be assimilated. They learned that centralized command was safer than distributed consciousness. They learned that negotiation was sometimes more effective than force. They learned to hesitate. They learned to fear. And those lessons, taken together, destroyed the only advantage they ever had: inevitability. The Borg are no longer inevitable. They are powerful, dangerous, and ruthless. But they are no longer unstoppable. They have been stopped, repeatedly, and each time they were stopped, they became less certain that they could win the next time. The final truth is this: the Borg were not defeated by the Federation. They were not defeated by species 8472. They were not defeated by time travel or sabotage or superior tactics. They were defeated by the cost of adapting to defeat. Every loss forced them to change. Every change introduced a weakness. Every weakness required a new adaptation, and every adaptation moved them further from the perfect unity that made them strong. The collective has become a patchwork of compromises, each one introduced to correct a failure, each one creating the conditions for the next failure. They are still dangerous, they are still a threat, but they are no longer what they were. They are no longer the Borg. They are what the Borg became when they learned how to lose.